Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Aaron Bastani. Tonight I'm joined by the immarketable Helena, aka No Justice, MTG. Coming up tonight, Lib Dem leader Davey has made his party conference speech in Brighton. The Jewish Chronicle is in crisis, with columnists publicly resigning from the publication. And Labour's Angela Eagle has a pretty tough time defending the party on this morning's media round. Stay tuned for all of that. But first, extraordinary events in Lebanon with exploding pages. And nearly 3,000 Hezbollah operatives have been injured in Lebanon. The weapon? Exploding pages used by the group to communicate. CCTV footage shows the moment one man's bag exploded in a Beirut supermarket with children just meters away. Hezbollah members were blown up in supermarkets, on the streets, in cars, at home, and in barbershops. We don't know in terms of other casualties whether or not they were members, if they had those handsets on their person, but that's what we know at the moment. Footage of those injured shows people with lost fingers and hands, as well as large abdominal wounds and facial injuries. According to Lebanon's health minister, 8 people have been killed so far, including an 8-year-old girl, and 200 more people are in critical condition. Those numbers will almost certainly rise by the hour. The severity of the injuries suggests that these injuries were not caused by batteries that were somehow triggered to explode simultaneously. Experts have also said footage of the explosions is not consistent with overheating batteries. 3 Lebanese sources have told Reuters that the pages were all of a modern model purchased by Hezbollah in recent months. The pages reportedly exploded simultaneously across Lebanon, with further casualties in Mount Lebanon and the southern Beirut suburb of Dahiyah. Large numbers of ambulances were deployed in Beirut to deal with scores of people injured. Lebanon's health ministry has asked all medical workers to return to work to assist the massive numbers of wounded. Healthcare workers have also been instructed not to use pagers. According to Haaretz, Iran's ambassador to Lebanon, Mojtaba Amani, is among those injured in the attack. Hezbollah has blamed Israel for the attack, with one Hezbollah official describing the attack as, quote, the biggest security breach since the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza. The group has also said that Israel will be punished. The IDF has so far not commented on the explosions, but an Israeli official appears to have briefly hinted at Israel's culpability for the attack. Topaz Luck, an advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, posted this in the wake of the wave of explosions. Has not aged well. That was in response to a post speculating that Netanyahu would not order any attacks on Hezbollah before returning from New York next week. That tweet was quickly deleted. The wave of pager attacks comes as Netanyahu increased the scope of Israel's war on Gaza. The goals of the war have now been expanded to include the securitization of Lebanon's southern border, allowing displaced Israelis to return to northern Israel. Around 60,000 Israelis have been evacuated from the area following cross-border attacks by Hezbollah since the start of the war. Hezbollah have said that their attacks will stop once Israel agrees a ceasefire with Hamas. But Netanyahu's new goal entails a direct confrontation with Hezbollah independently of any ceasefire in Gaza, marking a significant escalation of hostilities. Now, not everyone in Netanyahu's cabinet has always been happy with the Prime Minister's direction of travel. Netanyahu is reportedly planning to fire Israel's somewhat critical defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and may replace him with the right-wing Gideon Sa'ar, a hawkish former member of Likud. Gallant has recently made several criticisms of Netanyahu's military aims. In August, he took aim at the Prime Minister's goal of absolute victory, calling it absolute gibberish. But when it comes to Lebanon, the two now appear to be on the same page. Gallant today told an advisor to US President Joe Biden that military action was the only way to end the conflict with Hezbollah. The pager attack doesn't just represent an escalation in hostilities with Hezbollah, but if Israel is responsible for the attack, it also further displays the country's willingness to deploy new technology to kill and disable its enemies, as well as those around them from a great distance. Responding to the attack, political scientist Youssef Monea drew out the implications of this new kind of warfare. The apparent Israeli mass cyber attack in Lebanon, or that is unconfirmed if it was a cyber attack, that detonated cellular devices' pagers is a grave violation of international law and opens a dangerous Pandora's box. Almost every human is a walking, ticking bomb, and it won't be long before this tech will be used by many actors. Helena, this is a really good point, isn't it? We're seeing new kinds of tactic being legitimized constantly simply because Israel is doing it, but it's very important to say straight off the bat, this looks like a war crime because these would be indiscriminate attacks, and I can only presume nobody's going to say with a straight face that an 8-year-old girl is a member of Hezbollah.
The line that we had all seen, especially throughout the war on terror in the early 2000s, is that if you can just describe somebody as a terrorist, if you use that label towards them, it allows the West and Western military allies to be able to use whatever they want, regardless of whether or not it is war crimes or not. And we have seen previously, with regards to how Israel has treated the Palestinians over time, is that Israel has been allowed to continually treat the Palestinians and their other enemies, such as Hezbollah, as being lab rats, especially for kind of Western military technology giants, to be able to do new security technology and all of these kind of things, to be able to be used on the Palestinians to ensure that they can be used and sold to Western countries to be able to engage in the same kind of security actions than Israel has. This has been a consistent thing. It's why, of course, the America has continually protected Israel as its outpost in the region for its own broader military and geopolitical aims. Now, I do think that this will not see broad amounts of coverage. It will not be held to account as something which is potentially very illegitimate in terms of international law. And this is just, at the end of the day, I unfortunately believe that whilst, of course, this is a violation, it's not as much of a violation as we've seen elsewhere in Gaza throughout this entire conflict. So something that could have large potential impacts for opening up Pandora's box, so to say, of other countries engaging in this now that Israel has been legitimized doing so, might quite unfortunately be overshadowed by so many other far more grave and far more noticeable breaches of humanitarian law that Israel has engaged in from October the 7th up until today, because of course they haven't been held accountable for those things either. So it's very troubling to see what could come from this if this doesn't receive a lot of pushback.
I think that's very well said. And it is very important to say that it's quite clear, I think, under international law that Israel has committed war crimes repeatedly. We know that that's been confirmed by various international bodies, in their estimation anyway, of course. Same is true of Hamas on October the 7th. But this is another different kind of warfare, different kind of conflict being played out in a different kind of way. That first video I played you, by the way, yes, it was in that person's bag. It seems to have caused absolutely no injury to anybody around him. But it's shocking to see in a citizen/civilian setting, you're in a grocery store, you're buying food. There were two small girls meters away from that happening. And that to me is the dictionary definition of terrorism. There are people going about their everyday life, doing something like buying food, and somebody is maimed, somebody is killed, somebody is injured. And as we've seen, it seems, other innocent people, of course, I'm not suggesting that there's anybody that's guilty and deserves this, but people who are in no way connected to Hezbollah are also dragged in, as is allegedly the case with an 8-year-old girl who has been killed. That is terrorism. That is terrorism. Why do I use that word? Because it's about creating a sense of terror, panic, and fear within the broader population. That is the dictionary definition of terrorism. The Liberal Democrats won the largest number of MPs in over 100 years in July's general election. It was their best result in the party's modern history. So when Lib Dem leader Davey gave the closing speech at the party's conference, his mood was jubilant. But he soon turned the biggest barrier to Lib Dem electoral success before this July, namely trust.
We were still licking our wounds, weren't we? From an extremely disappointing general election result, our third in a row. Some were asking not whether our party could recover, but whether we would survive. And it's important we remember that as we celebrate and as we plan for the future, because we mustn't forget the hard lessons we learned along the way. Above all, we learned how critical it is to listen to our constituents, hear the people, understand their problems, know their priorities. Our liberal tradition of gritty community politics used to be so great at that, at listening. But somehow it got lost or undervalued. So we, along with all the other parties, lost people's trust. And it's been a long road to rebuild it.
No mention of the coalition government there. Of course, Ed Davey was a minister in that government between 2010 and 2015. Instead, we hear community relations was why they lost trust. Community relations. He makes it sound like a youth centre closed down their basketball court. Davey also outlined his party's policy priorities.
We asked people for their votes on a very clear manifesto. We told them we would focus on their priorities, getting our economy back on track and getting the cost of living under control, ending the sewage scandal and protecting our precious environment, and above all, fixing the NHS and care crisis.
You caused the crisis. We're going to fix the crisis. Well, maybe they're uniquely placed to fix the crisis because they know how it was started. There was, of course, the recent Darzi report published by Labour. Lord Darzi is a Labour lord. He's a former doctor, and maybe he's still a doctor, but he's a doctor with a great deal of experience. And that report squarely puts blame on the coalition government for the state, the parlous state of the NHS and social care in this country. The problems really came home to bite between 2010 and 2015 when Ed Davey was in government. Anyway, the question begs to be asked, how do we begin to repair the problems in our health service? Ed Davey pointed to some structural issues that need to be overcome.
The Treasury simply isn't wired to think this way. Instead, we have the short-term negative thinking that leads governments to postpone hospital repairs and cancel new buildings. Short-term thinking to save a bit of money now, even though you know it will only cost a lot more in the future. Practically every year I can remember, governments have ended up announcing hundreds of millions of pounds of emergency funding to help the NHS through another winter crisis, to paper over the cracks. What if instead of stumbling from crisis to crisis, instead of throwing more and more money at just plugging the gaps, what if we invested now to make the NHS winter-proof? The government could and should make this year the last winter crisis in our NHS. So I urge Labour, do not make the same mistakes the Conservative Party did. Be more positive. Act now. Show the ambition and urgency this moment demands and save our NHS for good.
Before we go any further, I want to remind you, but I don't want you sort of thinking you misheard what he said there. He wants to say to Labour, don't repeat the mistakes of the Conservatives. How about the mistakes of the Lib Dems? During the election, Ed Davey opened up about his son, John, who requires round-the-clock care for a neurological condition. The social care system was a central policy focus of the Lib Dem manifesto. And in today's speech, Davey reaffirmed that commitment.
Everyone knows the Conservatives don't care. But did you know carers weren't mentioned once in Labour's election manifesto? And carers weren't mentioned once in the King's speech either. But carers did feature in Keir Starmer's first Prime Minister's questions because I made sure they would. Prime Minister, if you are willing to find a solution, I am ready and willing to work with you and get it done for carers.
But the real purpose of the speech was to outline what the Lib Dems plan to do with their renewed parliamentary success.
Using our strength as not only, once again, the third party in the House of Commons, but also the largest third party in a century, to be the responsible opposition to this government and to speak up for people in our communities taken for granted and ignored by the others, telling ministers directly about the problems real people are facing, raising the issues that would otherwise go unnoticed in the government's blind spots, holding Labour to account for the promises they made to clear up the Conservatives' mess, championing practical, hopeful solutions for a better future, not just on health and care, but the cost of living, sewage, nature, and the climate, the crisis in our justice system, prisons bursting at the seams, criminals walking free, victims denied justice, and the pressing need to fix our broken relationship with Europe. The modern Conservative Party is so out of touch with so many of their former voters, so far removed from the real lives of ordinary people, that it no longer merits a place at the top table of our politics. We can't let them back after all the damage they've done to our great country. We can't let them off the hook after the chaos and misery they've caused. Friends, our job is to consign the Conservative Party to the history books.
Remarkable. Ed Davey there speaking today for quite a long time, and there wasn't a jet ski in sight. Helena, this is obviously a really great line that is very effective for the Liberal Democrats. They say to potential Labour voters, vote for us to keep the Tories out. And of course, they say to potential Tory voters, vote for us to keep Labour out. But in the last election, it was very much about keeping the Tories out. It was a very profitable line of attack for them. But what do you make of this pitch, really, from Ed Davey, of the Liberal Democrats being a bottom-up, grassroots party, given they were A, part of the austerity coalition, and then for a good 2-3 years talked about nothing but stopping Brexit?
So, cards on the table. Like you, Aaron, I really don't like the Liberal Democrats. They are a weather-vane party who always takes whatever tactical position is right for them electorally, rather than having a consistent platform or beliefs, unless it's saying that Brexit is really bad and the most important thing that the country should be talking about. And when a couple of stats here talking about this stuff about the NHS being blatant hypocrisy. So it's not just the Darcy report that lays bare the failures of the coalition government on the NHS. The COVID inquiry very specifically pointed this out. And you can see both George Osborne and David Cameron squirming in their videos during the COVID inquiry, having to answer these questions around how austerity damaged our NHS during this period. It's well worth a watch. And the stat that everyone needs to know is that NHS spending as a percentage of GDP dropped every single year under the coalition government, every single year. So the Lib Dems are in no position at all to critique anybody else around the state of the NHS and the mistakes. I mean, even when the Lib Dem representative was being interviewed on Politics Live yesterday, they kept saying 9 years of Tories because they didn't even want to admit that their party propped up the Conservative government for 5 years, which is quite funny to me. However, what I will say is that there were some words about the Labour government during Ed Davey's speech, but nothing was a very kind of strong attack. A lot of it was, oh, we want to push you to be a little bit better on this specific issue. We'll work with you if you want to propose something, which, whilst pretending to be holding the government to account, doesn't really look like that to me. What this looks like is words to, like, at least so that they're not the same party. But really what this is a Liberal and Labour non-aggression pact, a secret, a silent non-aggression pact. They're not saying openly, they're not discussing it openly, but it's clear that that's what's going on here. They're trying to attack the Tories from two different sides. Now, the reason why that they're allowed to do this might make sense for them as a party who only ever focuses on what's best for them electorally is an interesting artifact of post past the post, which a lot of parties have noticed on the left, and a lot of parties on the right just haven't noticed at all. And the Liberal Democrats have noticed very clearly they have nothing to gain from trying to be the foil to the Labour Party, even when they're in government. The seats where the Liberal Democrats are doing well because of tactical voting at the last election, it's all Tory heartlands. It's all in the southwest, it's all in suburbia, it's all in like kind of semi-rural communities, but outside of the north, which is really Labour reform territory, where reform did much better than the Conservative Party. And what the Liberals have noticed, what the Greens need to notice, and what Labour have successfully conquered by being voter efficient, and Reform UK and the Conservative Party just haven't noticed at all, is that this country has balkanised into where its voter groups lie. So the Liberals have noticed they're in the southwest. Reform UK haven't really noticed. They actually just need to be attacking the north and counties on the coast, like constituencies in coastal areas, clearly in Wales as well. And the Conservatives have basically got no base; it's spread very thin. And the Labour Party have managed to maximise getting as many votes that they need in swing constituencies, whilst there is a large Green percentage in inner city places. So whilst the Liberal Democrats, they have nothing to gain from attacking the Labour government, literally nothing at all, because everybody realises where the attacks on the Conservative Party lie. And so the Conservative Party, if the Liberal Democrats continue this strategy, and they are successful at doing this, whilst them and Labour essentially are attacking the Conservatives from multiple different angles with Reform UK as well, it does seem to me that they're going to probably increase not only their vote share, but also their share of the constituency at the next election, whilst most other places, especially the Conservative Party, will probably lose out. And that, even if you don't like what they do, and I very much dislike it, I think it's very dishonest, it's going to be a really successful electoral strategy for them coming up to the next election, in my opinion.
I think that's likely right. I went to Godalming ahead of the last general election. That's, of course, where Jeremy Hunt managed to stay on. And it did really feel like the Liberal Democrats were going to get over the line. That was the only seat, I believe, in the country with a Gales that was targeted by the Lib Dems and that they didn't win. Gales Britain. Of course, they have a historic heartland in the southwest, West Country, but particularly in the southeast, Winchester, Chichester, and Godalming. They took the first two. They didn't take that last one. These are all places with Gales. That tells you something about the sociological composition now of the typical Liberal Democrat seat. We will be talking about the Liberal Democrats, I'm sure, at some point in the coming weeks. We don't talk about them very much, but they are now a very important party. There was a really interesting article in the FT over the weekend. There is a historic amount of business interest in the Liberal Democrats because there's 70 of them. We forget that. There's more Lib Dem MPs than any third party. I think, what's this, the 1920s? Of course, the Liberals were in government in the 20s. The Lib Dems only really exist since the mid-80s. But it's unprecedented in the last 80 years, certainly, to have a party in England that's not Labour or the Tories on this scale. In July's general election, the Green Party of England and Wales quadrupled their number of seats, going from 1 MP at Westminster to 4. Two of those seats were rural and previously voted Tory, North Herefordshire and Waveney Valley. And meanwhile, the other two had Labour in second place, Bristol Central and Brighton Pavilion. That led some, including myself, to ask who the average Green voter now is, and whether it's really useful for the Greens to define as a left-wing party at all. Well, that's precisely what some of its members want to do. And at their recent party conference, they launched Greens Organise, a left-wing group within the party seeking to advance an anti-capitalist and ecologically transformative agenda. Joining me now is Zoe Garbett, a Green member of the London Assembly and one of the founding signatories of Greens Organise. First question. The last Green Party manifesto included commitments to public ownership at really large scale, a 4-day week, a universal basic income. Was that manifesto not sufficiently left-wing for you?
So I'm really excited to be here talking to you about Greens Organise, which is a group of members that have come together to really protect our kind of left socialist values and to bring together a group of people who really want to protect and propel the party in the kind of left direction. And I don't think this is, it's a group of people that are really excited to come together to talk about these issues and to these policies to protect and grow this element of the party. As you said, loads of success, 1.8 million people voting for us nationally. But also we're responding to the urgency of this moment. We're seeing far-right kind of racist riots on our streets, and we're seeing the Prime Minister meet with the kind of far-right fascist in Italy. And I just think it's a real moment of saying, this is who we are, and we want to have a place to kind of really welcome socialists, people who share our values, and be a space to kind of connect with people. We've already had people join the party because of Greens Organise, as well as, organisations reaching out to us to join our network and to be involved in what we're doing.
And in that election, you won 2 seats from the Conservatives, North Herefordshire, Waveney Valley. And then you have 2 seats where Labour is second. They're really different seats, Bristol Central, Brighton Pavilion, and then, like I say, Waveney and North Herefordshire. Very different. What's the future of the Green Party? If you had to choose, is it more seats like Bristol Central or is it more seats like North Herefordshire?
So I think this is about this broad support we've got across the country. As you just said, 1.8 million people voted for us across the country. Yes, there's kind of different kind of demographics and categories of those places that you've described. But, out on the doorstep in those places, people are hearing the same issues. A lot of people want publicly owned water and to kind of clean up our rivers and to protect the environment. A lot of people want publicly owned services. They want a properly funded NHS. And whether you live in a rented home in Bristol, you've got a grandchild that lives somewhere like Birmingham or around the country, you care about the future of our young people and wanting kind of rent controls and, so that, we've got broad support for our policies across the country and from a range of people and a range of voters. So I think our future is really positive. We've seen, I'm a Hackney councillor. We won a by-election last week. 16 years we haven't gained a seat in a by-election in London. So that's really exciting. And I just think it really shows this moment of people, really hearing more about what we're about and seeing, local and kind of London level and national level representation and seeing that we're the kind of politics that they want to get behind. And we're really grateful for everyone who's shown their support for us.
But I suppose it goes back to my original question, which is if you've got left-wing policies, and like you say, you're reaching a really broad sweep of people, what's the need for this organisation, this new organisation? Because it would imply that not everybody in the Green Party agrees with your platform. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to create it.
So I guess it's, it is new in the sense that it's a group of people coming together, but it is just amplifying all of the great things that we've been talking about. It's a group of people coming together in an organised way, looking at how they can function together to be a space where people can land as they come into the party. Because I know not everyone's a member of a political party, but they can sometimes be a bit tricky to navigate. And we really want it to be a space to support kind of working class and diverse candidates. We want it to be a space where, organisations can connect in with us and just have a much bolder and clearer position on these values that I think are our, I'm most proud of. Things like, addressing wealth inequality, having a wealth tax, full support of renters' rights, supporting, anything that really challenges the, kind of the status quo that's got us into the catastrophes that we're currently experiencing. Anything from the climate crisis to, greed and wealth inequality. So, it's more amplifying what we're good at rather than creating something new.
That point about landing is really interesting because often people join political parties and then they say, what next? Finally, you mentioned a moment ago picking up that award, a new councillor in Hackney through a by-election. If I had to pin you down on winning a constituency in London in the next 5 to 10 years, you're second in a bunch of them now, where would you say, you know what, we've got a really good chance of winning that seat in 2028, 2029, or the early 2030s?
Oh, it's an incredibly exciting time to think about the next general election. We've got our eyes on the local elections in 2026 and growing our councillor support. But we're definitely seeing strong support in the northeast. So I'd say a constituency, in the northeast of London. That's where we did really well in the London elections. It's where we're growing councillors. And we did, we got 26% in Hackney South and 22% in Hackney North. So definitely somewhere in the northeast.
Zoe Garbutt, thank you for joining us here on Novara Live. That is interesting, isn't it? The Greens might be targeting a Hackney seat in the next 5 to 10 years. Possible. That meeting for Greens Organise is tonight at 8 p.m. You can find the link to it if you head over to X and click on the pinned tweet or zeet from the accounts at Greens Organise. It's open to Green Party members and non-members of the party alike. Very exciting. The Jewish Chronicle is the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world, having been in continuous circulation since 1841. But the reliability of its reporting on Israel has now come under question following a number of investigations by Israeli journalists. And long-time columnists are abandoning it as a result. The story begins with a speech from Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, defending his aim to maintain an Israeli military occupation on the Philadelphia Corridor. Now, the Philadelphia Corridor is a narrow strip of land surrounding Gaza's border with Egypt, and Israel's intention to remain in control of it has been both a recent addition to ceasefire negotiations and an impossible concession for Hamas. In that speech, Netanyahu gave this argument for the occupation.
If you leave this corridor, you can't prevent Hamas from not only not smuggling weapons in, you can't prevent them from not smuggling terrorists, hostages out. It's walking distance, nothing. They can easily smuggle hostages out here to the Sinai Desert in Egypt. They disappear. It's crossing distance. The distance is nothing. It's meters away. They cross the barrier above ground. They don't even have to go underground. They disappear in the Sinai, and then they end up in Iran or in Yemen. They're gone forever.
A day after that speech, the Jewish Chronicle published this article. It claimed that papers captured by the IDF, as well as information obtained under interrogation, revealed a secret plan by Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar to smuggle Israeli hostages to Iran via, you guessed it, the Philadelphia Corridor. And that story gained traction. It was reprinted in right-wing newspapers in Israel, and it was promoted online by influencers including Netanyahu's son, Yair. Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, repeated the same line about the plan to smuggle hostages to Iran to the families of hostages just a few days later. There was a problem, though. That story was completely false. A day after the Jewish Chronicle published its so-called exclusive, Israel's Channel 12 News had its own story. Using testimony from security sources, Channel 12 completely refuted the Jewish Chronicle's reports on the alleged Sinwar plan. Channel 12 reported that, quote, all of the relevant sources in the security establishment deny having evidence of any such plan. Days later, Israeli outlet Ynet published this. Regarding the document that the, quote, Jewish Chronicle claimed to reveal, an examination of all the stores of captured materials collected since the beginning of the maneuver shows that no one in the AMSHT unit, Intelligence and Technical Materials Gathering, where these materials end up, nor the intelligence community in general, has any idea what it is or who it is about. Importantly, the IDF was also not happy about the Jewish Chronicle story. It launched an investigation into the source of these false claims, based on claims that the story was planted as part of a deliberate misinformation campaign. So who was the author of the piece? Their name is Elon Perry, and since the start of the war, they've written a series of sensational articles, often relying on intelligence leaks. One of them, headlined "The Real Reason Hamas Can't Release the Hostages," was also debunked by Ynet. This is from Israel's 972 magazine. Citing unnamed intelligence sources, Perry claimed that Hamas is currently holding only around 20 of the roughly 100 Israeli hostages who remain in Gaza, many of them allegedly handcuffed in the vicinity of Sinwar, and that the rest are in the possession of other militant groups, hence delaying a hostage deal. But an officer in the Israeli army's Prisoners and Missing Persons Division told Ynet that the army knows such claims to be bullshit. Attention then turned to Perry's biography. On the Jewish Chronicle's website, Elon Perry was described as a former commando soldier of the elite Golani Brigade of the IDF. He also claimed to have been, quote, a journalist for 25 years, covering wars and terrorist attacks. And he listed himself as lecturing on Israel and Palestine in the UK and the United States. On his website, Perry also described himself as having been a professor at Tel Aviv University, as well as having taken part in Israel's Operation Entebbe. That was a 1976 operation to rescue hostage passengers from a plane held at Uganda's main airport. But much of that, it appears, is false, as 972 explain here. An investigation by Hazanor, a program on Israel's Channel 13, revealed on September 9th that there was no record of Perry having worked at Tel Aviv University, nor did he participate in Entebbe. What's more, the photo on his website purporting to show him undercover at a protest dressed as a Palestinian, which he labeled as being from 1992, was actually taken in 2015. In what appears to have been a sting interview, Hazanor's reporter challenged Perry regarding all of these discrepancies. Under pressure, Perry denied having been an undercover operative, despite this claim also appearing in his second book. He also denied having worked at Tel Aviv University, saying maybe the publisher got it wrong. And he denied having participated in Entebbe. When asked why his website claimed otherwise, Perry responded, "I don't go on my website. I didn't check it." Mr. Perry, if you're not writing your own personal website, who is? It's also been difficult to substantiate Perry's claim to have been a journalist for a quarter of a century. The Guardian reports this. Checks by The Guardian have found no evidence of any record of significant stories published by Perry as a report in English or Hebrew, except for the recent series of articles in the Jewish Chronicle, now alleged to be fabrications. Elon Perry has now been sacked by the Jewish Chronicle, and his articles have been deleted. But there are still questions to be answered about who the source of the fabricated leaks was. Ynet has reported that military sources suspect the leaks are being used to influence Israeli public opinion in favor of Netanyahu. The Jewish Chronicle article came out at a time when Netanyahu's power was being rattled by mass Israeli protests, calling for a hostage deal and an end to the Prime Minister's attempts to keep the war raging. Veteran Israeli journalist Shlomi Eldar posted an even stronger theory. It was clear to me that this was a leak from the Israeli Prime Minister's office, which is manipulating the foreign press to further tear apart Israel's divided society and save Netanyahu from the intensifying protests. The sad bottom line is that this is a well-timed campaign against the hostages' families. Let me repeat that assertion. The claim there is that the Jewish Chronicle published an article which, in the words of this gentleman, was a campaign or was the tool of a campaign against the hostages' families. Now, the fallout following the Jewish Chronicle's publication of what appears to be straightforward pro-Netanyahu propaganda has been severe. There's several Jewish Chronicle columnists, including David Badil, David Aronovich, and Jonathan Friedland, have now left the paper over the false stories. This is how Friedland explained his decision to quit the newspaper. The latest scandal brings great disgrace on the paper, publishing fabricated stories and showing only the thinnest form of contrition. But it is only the latest. Too often the JC reads like a partisan ideological instrument, its judgments political rather than journalistic. And Friedland's Guardian colleague, Hadley Freeman, has also left the Jewish Chronicle. She said this on the Today programme.
What it felt like increasingly was that the Jewish Chronicle was representing a more ideological rather than strictly journalistic point of view, and was becoming far more right-wing and far more in step with Netanyahu, which most British Jews, I would think it's fair to say, are not. And that is not why I wanted to join a British Jewish newspaper to represent the views of Netanyahu. I want to represent the views of British Jews, and it just became a point where I couldn't stay.
She joined the newspaper under the current leadership, but now she's leaving because I can't stay because of the current leadership. Both Hadley Freeman and Jonathan Friedland said they have long complained about the shadowy ownership of the Jewish Chronicle. Well, that's because nobody actually knows who owns it. The paper is owned by a consortium, and the only person we know who is publicly associated with it is Robbie Gibb. Just bizarre. So instead, the man taking all the flack is, of course, the editor, Jake Wallace-Simons. In response to this story, he said this. Obviously, it's every newspaper editor's worst nightmare to be deceived by a journalist. The Jewish Chronicle has cut all ties with the freelancer in question, and his work has now been removed from our website. Readers can be assured, that stronger internal procedures are being implemented. I understand why some columnists have decided to step back from the paper. I am grateful for their contributions and hope that, in time, some of them will feel able to return. I take full responsibility for the mistakes that have been made, and I will take equal responsibility for the task of making sure nothing like this can happen again. This is extraordinary. You have published a series of articles by a fantasist Walter Mitty figure, it seems, Okay, we've detailed all the evidence there. Make up your own mind. And your apology is to say that it will never happen again. How did it happen the first time? You've got somebody publishing articles for you saying he has 25 years of experience writing in English and Hebrew. Have you read any of them? Oh, he's writing all these stories with these sources close to the IDF. And actually, if you look, he's not written any articles for anybody anywhere. That might undermine his credibility somewhat, you might think. Helena, these figures like Jonathan Friedland, Hadley Freeman, are saying they can no longer write for the Chronicle. But the reality is the quality of this quote-unquote journalism isn't some stark break with how it's conducted itself in recent years.
I mean, it is funny. Elsewhere, I'd seen Jake Wallace-Simons talk about the Jewish Chronicle's like high journalistic standards, right? And when you can't even do like basic checks about the reality or the history of the people who are coming there to write for you, and say, well, this guy he turned up and he just said that he was a journalist for 25 years and he was formerly in the IDF and went to this university. Like, yeah, we just believed him at the time. We didn't do any background checks. We didn't actually try and interrogate whether any of these claims had any basis in reality. Like, did he also tell you that he was a Nigerian prince with $2,000 million to put into your bank account at the same time? That doesn't, to me, honestly, that doesn't scream high journalistic standards. And of course, the frustrating thing is that whilst Hadley Freeman is correct in saying that it's clear that for a very long time in this paper, there seems to be a line which is ideologically closer to trying to do what is best for the Netanyahu administration rather than for the international or even the British Jewish community at large. I think her criticisms are correct. It just seems silly that we're only reporting on this now, when, of course, we'd already seen the lax level of quote-unquote high journalistic standards at the paper, given what Ipso have said about them previously. You might want to ask Audrey White and Mark Wordsworth about whether they have the opinions of the Jewish Chronicle as having high journalistic standards, for example. And, of course, we'd seen loads of smear campaigns against us here on the left coming from that paper, which everyone took them as being verbatim at the time. Did anyone really question it? And there was a really great tweet by Jonathan Portes saying, well, actually, no. For a long time, people, Jews and non-Jews, have been criticizing the lines of this paper and its relationships with some incredibly unsavory figures, people like Melanie Phillips and Douglas Murray, for example. And yet it takes the very specific situation of them publishing what are entirely fake stories for anyone outside of like independent media who is in the mainstream media to actually have this broad scale criticism of what they have become. And of course, all these other writers, as you say, they had continued writing for them under the current leadership and the current ownership of the paper. And whilst all of those things were going on in the background, all of the like Ipsos statements about what they had done previously, and they never thought A, to make those public criticisms, or B, actually just cut ties with the paper entirely. And I think the biggest point of all of this is just how damaging it is for the broader Jewish community in this country, who, as Hadley Freeman has correctly stated as well, they broadly support the two-state solution. They want to see an end to the conflict, and they want to see release of the hostages, and they aren't really that hot on the Netanyahu administration itself, even if they are broadly ideologically Zionist. They're the heads of the organizations that are supposed to represent them in the media. The Jewish Chronicle is the longest running Jewish paper in this country. And the other people like the boards of deputies, for example, seem to be taking very much a pro-Israel line or the pro-Israeli government line on a lot of these issues that the broader community just does not share. And that's dangerous because what we're seeing from the Israeli government is horrific. And this isn't supported by the Jewish public entirely. And people are, I would argue anti-Semitically, trying to bring these two things together. And that is not being helped by organizations like the Jewish Chronicle just uncritically publishing things that are in support of the Israeli government, and especially when those things are complete fabrications.
This story, for me, is the culmination of an abject period for the Jewish Chronicle. In 2022, there had been, or by 2022, there had been 33 breaches of the Ipso editorial guidelines of practice. 33 times, 33 breaches. Now that happens, okay? You're an outlet, you publish regularly, sometimes every day, sometimes weekly. You might just have a monthly magazine. If you're publishing regularly, you're going to make mistakes. That happens. Hopefully you're regulated. In the case of Ipso, it's quite a weak regulator, but in any case, there's something there. and you can be corrected and you can make apologies. That happens. Novara Media's done it. That happens. But 33 breaches in 3 years is absolutely without precedent, as far as I understand. If somebody wants to correct me, please go ahead. And here's where it gets really interesting. I've already mentioned Robbie Gibb. He's on the BBC board. So the man associated with this publication, in terms of its ownership, the only person we know associated with it is Robbie Gibb. He's on the BBC board of an outlet where they publish articles of global impact, global consequence by a person who's never written anything before. Imagine if somebody came to Novara Media and said, I have evidence that Iran has nuclear weapons and they plan to use them against the United Kingdom. We'd go, wow, that's extraordinary. Who are you, by the way? We'd want to see their recent work. But apparently that's too much for the Jewish Chronicle. Absolutely incredible. And then, of course, Robbie Gibb, brother of Nick Gibb, Tory MP. Robbie Gibb, yes, at the BBC, now on their board, previously very influential in terms of political broadcast. In between, went to work at number 10 Downing Street. You're looking at here at the nexus of politics and media in this country in a single person. And I think this story really exemplifies how bad, how unprofessional these people can be. Labour's polling is getting very bad very quickly. Last week, the governing party was on just 29% in the polls. Reminder, in June, they were polling 45%. And meanwhile, the government's approval rating is now minus 36, and 6 in 10 voters say Prime Minister Keir Starmer can't be trusted. And it's beginning to feel like poor media appearances are becoming the norm. Here's Labour Minister Angela Eagle earlier today on Good Morning Britain.
Back in 2017, you visited a retirement housing complex and said that one of the things that stood out for you was that residents were rightly angry about the Tory threat to take away the winter fuel allowance. How come you voted in the House of Commons then to take away the winter fuel allowance from 10 million pensioners?
Look, I mean, I voted to bring it in the first place when pensioners were in much more poverty when we came into government in 1997 than they
punish them
are
now?
We have we have a £22 billion hole in the public
Why do pensioners
finances.
have to pay for that?
Well, there'll be a series of things that we have to do to stabilise our economy and get it growing again. And I'm sure that the Chancellor will be talking about that in the forthcoming budget. I am at least satisfied that the pensions triple lock is remaining. That means pensions are going to rise by 2.5% by earnings or by inflation,
right,
whichever is
even
the highest.
for those who are going to get any increase in their pension, that doesn't come in until the spring. We spoke to Judith, who's in her 80s. Therefore, she loses, because she's not eligible for pension credit, she is about to lose £300. And she's worried about the other things you might do to people like her. Let's have a listen.
Can I ask everybody to write to the Prime Minister and your MP and say, please...
Think again.
Think again. Please don't abolish the bus pass, because we rely on that. Please don't take away our single person's tax relief from council tax, because we don't deserve it. We deserve better.
Yeah.
Well, and I never thought a Labour government would do that. Never.
Are you going to take away the single person's council tax discount?
I'm not in the Treasury. I don't know what the situation is with the fiscal consolidation that has to happen.
I don't know. By the way, in 2016, the Labour right wanted Angela Eagle to lead the Labour Party. They thought that person was good enough to be the Prime Minister. And I'm not joking. Here she is. This is a great picture. At the launch of her candidacy back then, when they tried to remove Jeremy Corbyn, her logo looks like some knockoff perfume you can only find in TK Maxx or Home Bargains. Also, at the beginning of that, yes, I voted to take away this benefit from most recipients. It's going down from 12 million to 2 million recipients. But 27 years ago, I voted for it, okay? 27 years ago. You can't have it both ways. Should pensioners have this or not? You can't say they shouldn't have it today, but they should have had it 27 years ago. Now, that wasn't the only appearance Angela Eagle had today. It turns out she was doing a media round. Maybe John Ashworth had to meet a man about a dog. Here's Eagle speaking to Times Radio.
Let's boil it down. Why shouldn't the Prime Minister, he earns 166 grand a year, why shouldn't he buy his own glasses?
Well, why don't you ask him?
Well, he's not here. You're here for the government. I mean, if he comes on here, we might try...
I am, but I'm afraid I'm not responsible for decisions the Prime Minister makes.
You're not, but you have an
glasses.
opinion. But should he not buy his own glasses? You're wearing a pair of glasses now. You presumably paid for them yourself. I'm wearing a pair of glasses now. I paid for them myself. Why shouldn't the Prime Minister?
Well, the Prime Minister has had his say on that, and if you next time you interview him, you could ask him yourself. I don't have an opinion.
You must have an opinion
on what the Prime Minister does in these instances.
Well, I'll tell you why you might have an opinion, because Angela Rayner had an opinion when Boris Johnson was getting money from donors. She tweeted, "What right does a man who complains he can't live on 150 grand a year and asks Tory donors to fund his luxury wallpaper habit, what right does he have to lecture someone trying to survive on £80 a week?" That's what Labour attacked Boris Johnson for doing. And now you've got someone who has a luxury glasses habit, who's taking money from pensioners. People are going to have an opinion on that, aren't they?
Okay, you've had your rant.
Is that a rant? I'm asking a question. You're honestly saying that it's completely in your... No one's going to say to you in your constituency, why on earth is he and his wife getting free clothes and glasses, do you think?
Well, when I get back from Berlin and I go to my constituency at the weekend, I'll let you know.
Okay, you've had your rant. And by the way, if a Tory cabinet minister said that during the wallpaper stuff, they would be dragged. You've had your rant. Imagine Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, you've had your rant. There would be viral tweets from Otto English, James O'Brien, having a meltdown, calls to resign, maybe even a panorama documentary. I'm not joking.
With regards to the winter fuel stuff, and it's clear to me that Angela Eagle just doesn't believe any of the words that she's saying. I can't see into her soul, of course. This is just my estimation of her opinion on this. But as someone who I think I've seen Angela Eagle, I don't think she's necessarily somebody who takes personal joy in taking away money from pensioners. And so she's been forced by the Labour leadership decision on this to have to go out and defend it anyway. And it was clear to me that she was struggling to find the words to defend it because I don't think it's very defensible. The same is true for the conversation you're having about Starmer's being bought clothes by this Labour donor. It is indefensible. On Cross Question last night, Barry Gardner was asked the same position, saying, can you find any reason as to why a Prime Minister or his wife should be able to be getting this huge amount of clothes bought for them by a rich donor? And his answer was just no. No, I actually can't think of a reason to defend this. And what's silly is that because we're in this position, rather than actually being able to just admit that, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing this in future, we got it wrong, they're trying to defend the indefensible. Again, it is indefensible because they made those same attacks against Boris Johnson for identical reasons, right? Let's be very, very clear. The wallpaper incident, where it was just a rich person buying Boris Johnson fancy wallpaper and a rich person buying Starmer and his wife fancy clothes, right? These are identical situations. The criticisms are identical. So the defences are also equally nonsensical. Although, to be fair, I will give Angela Eagle at least a bit more. I'll be a little bit more sympathetic to Angela Eagle on this than I would be for David Lammy, saying some nonsense about, well, in America, they've nationalised the ability to be able to buy clothes for the Prime Minister, which is a terrible defence. But her just saying, I think this is a non-story, I'm not here, why don't you ask here? To me, whilst it doesn't seem a particularly good answer optically, it is at least an answer that is a bit more truthful than what Lammy was saying, or at least we're closer to like a defensible position. Well, the one thing I'll finish off this discussion with is that with regards to the fact this is a Times radio interview, I find it very funny. Like Peter Obon tweeted out today that he remembered the Times trying to bury the story or trying to suppress the story around Boris Johnson trying to employ Carrie Simons as a £100,000 a year chief of staff. And yet, very interesting, they're very happy to hammer Labour on this issue. Personally, rather than the Conservatives thinking that Labour are at fault and the Conservatives aren't, and the Liberals thinking that the Conservatives are at fault but Labour aren't, maybe we should be critiquing both sides of this discussion, regardless of which side you're on basis of kind of morality or ethics on this. Maybe that's just me.
If somebody is buying the Prime Minister, like you say, some William Morris wallpaper or some Christian Dior ties, there's no real difference here. And by the way, it's not just close. Which Keir Starmer is getting galore in terms of freebies. It's not just wardrobe gate, it's football tickets too. In response to questions about him taking hospitality tickets for football, Keir Starmer told Bloomberg that he had no alternative. I can't go into the stands because of security reasons. Therefore, if I don't accept a gift of hospitality, I can't go to a game, Starmer said. Never going to an Arsenal game again because I can't accept hospitality is pushing it a bit far, he said, without explaining why he couldn't pay for a hospitality ticket himself. Now, the cheapest hospitality tickets at the Emirates are around £800. It's a lot of money. If you're going to go a few times a season, I don't really see the problem. You're Prime Minister, you earn around £160,000 a year. But in any case, his argument about only being able to go if there's hospitality because of security, nobody else could go in my position, isn't true. Here's Jeremy Corbyn. It's like, where's Wally? Of course, I would never call Jeremy Corbyn a Wally. I wonder what he's looking at there. Maybe Hector Bellerin giving away possession. He had a great first couple of seasons, but he really fell off. Now, you might be saying, look, he was the opposition leader, Aaron. Okay, that's really impressive that he's just there in a stand, but it's not the same as the Prime Minister. Okay, well, here's Rishi Sunak at St Mary's Stadium watching Southampton. As you can see, he's actually meeting ordinary people. Now, I'm sure he has extensive security on his person there, but this still undermines Keir Starmer's central point. And then there's the fact that Starmer not only remains unapologetic for taking free clothes from Labour Party donors, as well as the free hospitality, but plans to continue doing it. This is from The Guardian. Keir Starmer has suggested he will continue to accept gifts from the Labour peer Lord Ali, as he rejected accusations that he had not followed parliamentary rules relating to gifts of clothes to his wife. The Prime Minister said there was a massive difference between declarations and corruption, and said he did not accept the notion that taxpayers should fund clothes for senior politicians and their spouses. I feel like there's a third option here between the taxpayer buying your Christian Dior ties and Labour Party donors doing it, Keir. I feel like we have some middle ground. Maybe you could buy your clothes yourself. After all, before politics, you're one of the most senior lawyers in the country. You've earned the best part of six-figure salaries for most of the last 20 years. You were on £200,000 a year as Director of Public Prosecutions, a job you had until 2015, and yet you can't pay for your own ties and glasses. And the alternative is not the taxpayer paying for it. Unreal. Imagine doing all that with a straight face, defending it, saying, I'll do it in the future, whilst you're cutting the winter fuel allowance for 10 million people. Keir Starmer's doing just that. Helena, thanks for this evening.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
It was a pleasure. We are slightly over time, but you know what? We did so much there. Really big stories in 1 hour. Fox is going to be so proud of me. Thanks everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.